Well, hello and welcome to the first episode of Code Blue. Code Blue is where we'll be discussing items and issues important to defensive security and blue teams. I'm Chad Lemaire, Chief Security Officer at Echelon, and I'll be moderating today's session. Leading up to this, we had many discussions in preparation for this series, and identity always came to the forefront when we discussed which topic should be first. So today, we'll be discussing the role of identity in modern security landscapes. I'm excited to be here with two amazing coworkers, along with a great friend of nearly 30 years. Our special guest is Dave Newman, two-time CISO and VP for Global Operations. Dave, welcome. Can you provide a little bit more on your background?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chad and Chris and Paul. It's great to see you again. Yep, doing this for about 30. Been doing this for about 39 years now, and through a variety of things. That 30-year friendship that Chad refers to is my time in the Air Force. 28 years as both an enlisted guy and an officer. So to work for a living, and then gotten an opportunity to do some really interesting things on the command side with cyber hunting units and those kinds of things. So really excited to be here. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm excited to have this conversation with our audience.
Yeah, thanks. Not really sure how to take that work for a living piece, but in addition, I'd like to introduce the Director of Defensive Security for Echelon, Chris Furtick. He has a superb background in defensive security and incident response. So Chris, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chad. So as Chad mentions, I'm Director of Defensive Security here at Echelon. So have been in cybersecurity for a little over a decade, primarily in consulting, but also security leadership, as well as incident response. So I've seen a lot of things over time, and I really enjoy helping our clients avoid the bad things and secure their environments.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, and rounding out today's panel is Paul Matvey. Paul's a manager in defensive security for Echelon. He has a passion for all things defensive security and especially zero trust. So, Paul, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Yes, I work with Chris on the team here, and we help our clients be more secure where the rubber meets the road. So we're big believers in zero trust architectures, and looking at the current state of infrastructures and really what solutions can be layered on to protect our clients and organizations, and also harden the things that are in place. So how do we take all the things and make them more secure, and what systems need to be put in place to prevent our clients and their valuable data?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So as mentioned, right, we're here to talk about identity. And Dave, first question to you. It's been said that identity is a new perimeter. Would you agree with that statement?
I think that statement infers that there's no perimeter. And I think that is very much the case now. We are seeing so much integration and the emergence of so much new technology in how we connect, how we live, how we work, how we run our governments, and so many other things, how we learn and educate, that I think that is a pretty accurate statement. I think identity is one of those components, probably one of the most important. So, yeah, the days of the perimeter are long gone.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I think as we look at, even as cliche as it may sound, as identity as new perimeter, we've seen that used for several years now. I think it's important. This is why we've had that paradigm shift, right? As folks are working remotely, kind of to Dave's point, almost anything could be an identity, right? We could have a device could have an identity. Almost anything that's an entity that we could attribute unique characteristics to, we can be considered an identity. So it's really important that we think about how do we build an identity access structure that's nimble enough to accommodate for all these new identities that are coming through, right? An identity could be a device like we talked about. It could be a large language model, for example, right? It could be an API integration. So all these things are changing what we think of as perimeter.
Chad never wanted to let me get away with homework. He gave me some homework at about 11:30 last night. I think it was just like, what is the definition of identity in a cyber world today? So I'm looking down at my paper because I didn't want to get it wrong for Professor Lemaire. But I define it as a set of characteristics used to verify or authenticate access and privilege, right? Notice I didn't say access users or access some of the things that you talked about, Chris, right? I believe that the characteristics of identity are changing so quickly, and that it is. And the one thing that I would say is there's a lot of discussion around like, is that's really asset management? There's some close connection there. There's no doubt about that. But look, I think that my car can have an identity, especially when it communicates with outside things, right? Whether it's other cars, whether it's to a maintenance thing. So we're seeing that in autonomous technology in general. So I think that's the one distinction between asset management. Yes, asset management is a management function and a technology function that's super important. But now anything almost in that IT portfolio is communicating in some way. And that puts it squarely in the definition of identity, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I think it's really, really interesting to consider, we're the question here talking about perimeters. If you're a technical mind, you're thinking about firewalls and the things that people are logging onto, the attack surface. But I think you're right. The perimeter's kind of dissolving. We're accessing resources in various locations, behind networks. And with that in place, and think about zero trust models. The first pillar's identity, but also ultimately we get to a data and the ultimate resource here. So identity is the first pillar to fall, perhaps. And when we think about just authenticating, what is happening here? So it's an identity that is actually doing the authenticating, something that can be identified. And so if we think in those terms, then yes, it starts with identity in terms of perimeter, not necessarily being the what we interact with, but the core component where that needs to be considered when we're making these authentication decisions in terms of should something authenticate or be allowed access or not.
Yeah, I think you gentlemen, read my mind, and we were going to talk about whether or not identity was relegated, to just people. But it seems like we're all in agreement, right? It's more than people in the end. And so, with that in mind, why is identity so difficult to get right?
I'll go first on that one. I think there's three reasons that I really think of when I think of the challenges around identity. It starts with inadequate design and defined outcomes, right? The architecture components of this are really, really important, both in getting it right and getting it working, but also making it scalable and adaptable. And that goes to the second reason, which is, rapidly changing functions and environments. And by that, I don't mean just technology function. Think of an organization that does a merger or an acquisition or a divestiture. Think about an organization that launches a new product or a new line of business or those kinds of things. Those changing environments sometimes are, if you don't have a particular architecture and strong engineering function, they can get pretty bumpy. And then the last thing is I still think, we have this problem more broadly across the cyber industry is, we buy a tool without a plan, right? And especially in big enterprises. And if you're doing big enterprise identity modernization or transformation, those sometimes are multi-year projects. And you're not going to. Almost every organization that I've either been in or encountered, they have more than one identity platform. So, and that's just a byproduct of it being a super difficult problem. And so, when Paul did his intro of himself, we help clients where the rubber meets the road. And, I'm sure Paul has come to several clients where it's like, our tool doesn't work. Okay, well, what's your architecture look like? Well, I don't really pay any attention to that, So, it's not unusual, and it's not always surprising. But I think that those three things are most common in my mind that make it super difficult.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. You mentioned the architecture and the scalability. One thing that I think we should throw into that mix is usability, right? What's going to be easiest for the user? We have to make it just as easy for them to do the secure thing as it is to do the insecure thing. And I think we, as security professionals, have a reputation, so to speak, of being the department of no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. We have to be more inclusive with our users, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have around identity and access. Also, one thing that you didn't mention, Dave, but I'm sure you've ran into is a lot of legacy applications, right? So all the modern authentication, strong authentication tools that we could have, all the tools that you mentioned that are in our organizations don't always play well with the tools legacy type situation. So I think that's really a challenge, especially folks who have a lot of tech debt, and almost every organization has it, right? It's almost unheard of for us to go into an organization that's relatively large that doesn't have some type of tech debt and has some type of end of life device sitting around. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, no, I love that, Chris. Thanks for bringing that up. And I think it begs the question too, like, does your entire identity strategy or modernization stop or get held back because of those kinds of legacy applications? Depends on what they are, right? If they're critical business applications and doing those things, this is why it's intertwined, and it's really, really important to try to plan it out. But those are good points. Paul, what do you think? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point on the legacy applications, because you have to ask, are you changing things that are core to your business just because of some kind of technological need? And what is the ultimate outcome here? So I think you need to really be able to zoom out and really understand the business context of what you're trying to accomplish there, and really be able to understand also, how are we even quantifying risk in terms of access management, and what happens in an instance of gaining access to something. What does all this mean? And a challenge is, I think, identifying the strengths and weaknesses, and what do we know about identity. So what is even in terms of a human accessing a system. If I'm accessing a system, it's really a logical representation that's happening on networks and computers. We can't plug ourselves into a network, at least not yet. I've been accused of being a robot before, but we're not there. We're not there quite yet. So we have to think about what are all the elements that make up a person's identity. So thinking like, if you're going to get a driver's license or get an account at a bank, there's all kinds of things, data points that come into question here, that we use to really represent a person's identity, so that we try to establish some measure of trust. And we don't always have access to these. I think the legacy systems is a great example, because you may not have access to the data points to make these decisions. And I think that's one of the challenges, taking inventory of what we could have access to, what we do, what we're not going to have access to. And you really need to be thoughtful about these processes, and then map those to the technical solutions that you can employ.
One thing I'd like to touch on,
Go ahead, Dave.
I don't know that it was originally part of the agenda, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Artificial intelligence is almost the reverse of this problem, right? Artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, and then soon to come artificial general intelligence, is going to send information. It needs to be authenticated, right? And it's going to provide or push that kind of thing, for all the right reasons and doing those things. But now, to your point, you're not a robot. You're way too handsome, Paul, to be a robot, by the way. So, but we have to think about how those things are working, and then the input, right? We're already seeing poisoning of large language models. So, how is an input authenticated, right, or verified? Is that a valid thing? Because you could potentially wreck an entire LLM with this kind of thing. So the dynamics of like this idea of like I want to get access to that is going to be also the reverse, right? Something wants to get access out in some way. They're not too far discerned from things that we have traditionally today. Adversaries getting into enterprises and doing command and control, those kinds of things, and beaconing. But it's certainly a different dynamic when you're talking about vast amounts of data and then inferences that produce other data. And that's going to be really interesting as we get further into it.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I'll touch on and pass it to Paul. So when we talk about data poisoning and we talk about training the large language models, first off, we've got to sanitize the inputs that are coming in, right? Making sure they're coming from authenticated sources. You don't want to train your large language models with just any information, go out and crawl and figure things out. You certainly want to make sure those are valid. The next point is, how do we know that the person or entity or identity asking for the data is authorized to do so, right? So that would be where you would have potentially a large language model at the top layer doing the access and making sure there's authentication before it actually gets down to the data lake or the large language model that controls the data lake. So it's a little bit of an inception situation there where you've got to have multiple layers. But I think it's a challenge that some folks are already tackling. The problem I see is not enough folks are doing that now, and they're getting behind the eight ball, right? This thing is growing so fast, and I don't think the robots are coming to take my job next week or anything like that, but it's such a powerful tool set that we're integrating into our businesses. I don't think we're doing a really great job of steering the ship to making sure that we're doing that in a secure way.
Yeah, and Dave, I'll add, at my previous job, right, one of the things that we were making sure we were doing is data classification and data tagging. And I think those two things, right, will play a key role in being able to get after some of the things that you're talking about with regard to verifying, right, all that data that you're talking about. Paul, you had mentioned earlier, I want to move on for a moment. And for the audience, if we have time at the end of this, we're going to go ahead and take some questions, just so you know. So if you have any questions, please type it in the comment section, and if we have time, we will absolutely get around to it. But Paul, you had mentioned, and I talked about how ZT makes you smile, and we're probably about to see a halo around your head, right, as we move into a ZT type discussion here. But identity is one of the foundational pillars of zero trust, right? And I would argue it's probably the most important ZT pillar to get right first. Do you think, and this is open to the entire panel, right? But do you think that there's another pillar in ZT that's more important to get right, or is identity that pillar that must be done right and done first?
Yeah, I think identity is the first to get right first. I think the most important part of the zero trust architecture ultimately, or anything, is the data. It's what we're trying to protect, but that sometimes is the hardest part. And like you mentioned, data tagging and classification. This is something that organizations often struggle with, and ultimately it's really hard to say, how are we going to restrict access to these groups of people, in terms of certain data sets, if you can't classify that data. So for organizations that haven't embarked on a data classification strategy, and with all the things we're talking about today, I think there's a kind of stop the bleeding approach, and then moving forward, how do we start today and adopting these practices that are going to align to better security architectures? And data is definitely a big part of that. But yes, I think it starts with identity, because you have to understand who's accessing your systems, what rights they have, and with the perimeter kind of dissolving in front of us, these are definitely things that you have to do today. Attackers are logging into things in most cases, so they are defeating the perimeter, they're defeating our defenses, and even after they get access, ultimately there's some kind of authentication event in many cases here. So people and things are being impersonated. So we really have to better understand how we are securing our identities, know what things to think about and access events before we are really able to move on to the other pillars of zero trust.
Yeah, and Dave, I'd love to hear your insights on this, right, as a former CISO, and thoughts on identity and the importance of that pillar.
Yeah, I let's take it up a level. So when I think of the concept of operations or operational outcomes for zero trust, I think of explicitly verifying everything. Least privilege we talked about before the call, and then assuming you're breached all the time. So therefore you have all these other things, and so identity unquestionably is one of those things. Those mechanics or those pillars that underpin those operational outcomes. But as Paul inferred, this is all about data, and I think that the way we're using data today and the way we're going to use it even in the next year or so is completely different. So I think that there is a data pillar, and I don't know what else you say about that pillar yet, if I'm completely candid. Is that data orchestration? Is it data? Pick your description of data, but there is a data pillar that is super, super important here to understand. And that can go anywhere from encryption to segmentation to software design. It can just, goes a whole gambit of them. And that's where it needs to, it's probably something that would be interesting for Echelon to do, is publish a little bit on, those, what are the emerging pillars that may be relevant. I don't think that anybody disagrees that zero trust is not only a great security concept, but it's a great resiliency concept as well, right? And kind of military concepts, right? So every plan or no, everybody has a plan till you encounter the enemy, kind of thing. So we need to be prepared when some of these things don't work, and they're never going to always work all the time. So I think that I'd love to see Echelon work on that and think about, like, what are these emerging pillars as opposed to what they are today and what we need to think about. Go where the puck is going. Head where the puck is going. I know you guys don't have ice hockey in Hawaii, Chad.
So I think those are.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned assumed breach scenario, right? Assume that we're already being compromised. Assume that we have enemy within our new perimeter, so to speak. How does a CISO leverage a strong identity practice to limit the blast radius, right? What do CISOs need to be thinking about if they're going to have this assumed breached mindset, Dave?
So first of all, it's an understanding of the terrain, right? I was a CISO of a company that didn't have an identity platform. They had 5, and those platforms were used for everything from the access stuff that we're talking about, but provisioning of new capabilities and new customer assets and those kinds of things. So it was super, super complicated. So my biggest challenge is, how am I going to use this? There's no real system of record. They're all fragments of incomplete identity. Some of them were proprietary, right? That we made them over years, or they were made over years. And other were more contemporary, that we said, well, we'll use this platform for everything that's new, but we'll use these other platforms. That really, really complicates your terrain to be able to protect, defend, and then work with business unit partners to say, hey, I can't make this resilient for this particular threat or risk. How do we need to do this? So as a CISO, that was 90% of your job is up and outside the organization, and setting conditions for the things that you're tasked to do. That was always my toughest, and I've seen that time and time again. So not only get my hands around where we're at today, but as new things wanted to launch, it's like, okay, I need that. And then I become that guy goes, hey, I'm not saying no. I'm just saying, give me some bandwidth here. Give me some time and space to make sure it's architected well. I know I keep coming back to the architecture and design thing, but I think if I was starting my own company, or if I was a new CSO somewhere, That would be a function that I'm highly invested in, is just making sure we're doing it. And it's also outward facing, not just inward facing with respect to security design and architecture.
Yeah, and Dave, to your point about assumed breach, right? In my previous role, that's one of the things is we were architecting and engineering a new network, right? We were going to assume breach, and so we built it around really protecting the data, right? Because if you assume breach and know that somebody's on the network, the key is to protect that data so that only those that are truly verified, right? Hence identity being a huge part of it, could actually get access to that data if you assume that the breach is there. So if there's a problem on the network, right, is this a problem that only a tool can fix, right? There are tools that claim they can modernize the approach to identity, but for the panel, is this something that a problem that a tool alone can fix, or is there more to it?
I can start with that, Chad. I don't think in this particular instance, we're always looking for a solution to our problem here in IT and cybersecurity, and something that we can bolt on that's hopefully as holistic as possible. But particularly with identity and access management, it really starts with taking stock of what you have. There are so many things involved, and you mentioned, David, that you may have different identity stores. So, today most organizations may have Active Directory, but they also have Azure, and you may not find common technologies in all cases that really secure. You can't really say secure identities that themselves. This is something to be taken into consideration. So I don't think it's a problem that technology alone can fix. It really requires looking at the overall architecture and thinking about how are you going to orchestrate things. So again, going back to the different identity stores and the potential for that existence, you may have Active Directory, Azure. You may have a website that has a database backend with your customers' identities and a SQL or MySQL database, and you need to harden all of these things using security best practices, and you may need to bring them all together with another identity and access management system, or one that's made to be client facing, and then you have to secure those. So this may seem pretty obscure, but I think we interact with a lot of these systems on a daily basis. If you ever logged into a certain commerce sites, or maybe even Facebook, it says log in with Google or log in with Facebook. So these are systems that are really trusting other sources of identities, and there's multiple integrations that need to take place with other technologies, such as web application firewalls, if we're talking about a web app. And it really ends up being an architectural discussion, I think. So
The other thing is to answer your question directly, it can be. There can be tool solutions to some of these things. And let's not forget that here in the United States, at least, the backbone of our economy are small businesses. So, most of those businesses are not built on-prem. They consume technology services, massive growth and expansion of SaaS, for example. So, if you're in the business of making widgets and that's your thing, but you need some technology to help produce, sell, and deliver widgets, then you want to focus on that, right? You don't want to build a big enterprise with doing these other things. But let's just say you get a customer, I don't know, say the Department of Defense. Now you've got a whole bunch of other things that you got to think about from a regulatory standpoint or whatever. You want a piece of that wallet, but you need to do these things, and this is where the tool that you're using may not be appropriate or maybe something else. So. And then the other thing I would suggest is that where you need to think about not just the tool, but is it scalable? Is it adaptable? Because my company is going to grow. And when it grows, does the architecture I have grow with me? so much of what we do, and then we've talked a lot about architecture in this thing, but there's a business architecture that drives the rest of it. So, and that business architecture is tied to strategy as well. So how are you doing that? And try to be opportunistic in it, right? If you're doing something else in the technology realm to grow or expand a company, then there may be a new and interesting way, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater or something you've already done, because your fundamentals should still be there. And that should better inform what you're doing from an instrumentation or a technology standpoint.
Yeah, and so Dave, you kind of left the door open a little bit with saying, it may be just a tool, but can you provide a little bit more on some of the best practices that you had to do, right, as a former CISO to implement beyond a tool, right? How do we rethink an approach, and what are some of the potential solutions? And then, Chris, I know you had a comment, so I'll let you follow Dave after he provides the answer to that.
So I think one of the things that we really had to do is as I got my second CISO job, we weren't doing anything on the product side from a security resiliency standpoint. So I had to really go learn that environment, that terrain is kind of what Paul alluded to earlier. So learning that terrain and understanding perhaps where they had identity requirements, where there was no identity going on, or protection of certain kind of things that needed some better design on that. And what I discovered there was, and this is interesting, and I'm sure the CISOs that are tuned in today would agree with me, the values of our communities are different, right? So what do security people value? What do developers value? They value time to market. They value automation of everything. They value adoption and ease of tools. So, when I looked at that, I said, okay, how can I provide identity services to that business group that, by the way, was making products that paid our paychecks, right? And so that's one of the things that I think that is a reason that you need to be able to think about not only an architecture and implementation, but is what you're doing a service either to business partners internally, corporately, or from a covenant standpoint, or to customers. Paul brought this up earlier, right? Like, hey, I just want to log in with Google or Facebook, those kinds of things. How many users even know what that means or if that's okay? But the experience is pretty good, right? I mean, and be able to just say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. I'll use my Gmail account to log into that. Wow, that's pretty interesting. But it certainly makes our thing pretty complex. Now, we're going to talk about it later, but that user experience is pretty important. And there's an application experience as well, or a developer experience. And I'm not talking about human beings. I'm talking about the products that you're building. So integration was always something that was top of mind for me, and trying to be a business enabler as well as a defender.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And if we want to circle back, Chad, your previous question was, is there a tool that we could throw at an IAM problem and make it go away? And what I heard from Dave is not one tool can do it, but 5 is what you need from his previous roles. If you don't have at least 5 for a big organization, you're not going to get it done. Is that right, Dave?
No, that's not what I said. I inherited 5, and by the way, they weren't. None of them were my tools. By the way, none of those were my platforms. Right? I was trying to consume data from those platforms to do that. Yeah, I would have I actually had to do a development initiative to integrate with 5 different platforms so that I could do the defense, cyber defense, and resiliency role that was necessary for the customers, not only inside but outside the company.
That's a great point. And kind of the segue there is there a single magic silver bullet to fix all the IAM problems? And I don't think that exists, as we've talked about already. Where I've seen IAM projects fail over time is because we don't get the user buy-in either at the user level and make it easier for them to use, or at a leadership level above us, right? They don't understand what a journey IAM is. To your point earlier, Dave, this is a multi-year situation for larger organizations. So we don't have the buy-in from the people above us. We don't define success criteria, and we don't consider the users downstream. So I've seen projects fail in the past, and they have us come in and say, we've got this thing, but it never got off the ground. And then we start digging into it and try to figure out. And it's essentially all those things, right? We don't consider the human factor and how important that is. So I think that's really a great way to think about it.
Yeah, and Chris, you're touching on a topic that, and for the audience, we got one last question before we go to you for some comments or questions. But Chris, what you're touching on is, what are some of the mistakes, right, that we've seen happen over and over again as it relates to identity, and so what are those pitfalls that we've seen so that others can be aware of those and know to avoid them when it comes to identity?
Yeah, from my perspective, it's not defining your success criteria. It's going into this mission, and we're going into IAM, and we have this euphoria out there, but we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't have milestones. We haven't considered doing a holistic identity inventory, right? Figuring out what all the personas are, and that's what we're talking about here, right? Whether we're talking about identity of things, so all the devices that are in an enterprise. Machines, switches, routers, desktops, things of that nature. All of those things, you have to have a proper identity inventory first to understand what all the personas are. So I've seen folks not have that buy-in. And I think one thing that you said earlier, Dave, is problematic, but we hear it over and over again. Oftentimes security doesn't own IAM, right? They are consumers of the tool and they may advise on it, but they don't necessarily have the budget to pay for it or to implement it and things of that nature. So we're essentially at the mercy of IT and making sure that we're partnering really well with them to put the IAM strategy together. But those are some of the challenges that I think we've seen.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Dave. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
No, I just talking here. So a lot of what we're mentioning makes this seem to be a pretty massive undertaking, which it certainly can be. But I think, especially for everybody listening, I think there's some basic things that a lot of organizations can do today and get a conversation started as well. In terms of IT administrators, what are the privileged accounts that often get abused, and are we talking about these? So I think waiting a lot of times in cybersecurity until we get it all right, the attackers and risks aren't necessarily going to or wait for us until we have all the answers. So I think there's some simple things that a lot of organizations can get started today, thinking about privileged accounts, thinking about is MFA in place in basic points where it should be? Are we putting MFA in front of Microsoft 365 and these services that we all consume? So I think there's some simple things we can do as businesses and consumers that we probably already know that we can do ourselves and in our own lives, that make this something that we can bite off on, as appropriate as well, instead of just waiting to have it all figured out. So that's something where I see organizations like wait until they have all this mental construct together to understand this. But looking at identity stores, security of our Active Directories in Azure, the core things that we rely on as businesses and IT administrators on a daily basis. There's always something that we can do, I think, today in our organizations. So that's just a thought that came to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And Dave, in your time as a CISO, and I'm sure you didn't make any mistakes whatsoever, especially early in your career doing it.
Not before 6 a.m. anyway.
Yeah, that's right. What are some of the things that either you've noticed your organizations had done, or a fellow CISO? What are some of the mistakes, issues that you've seen as it relates to identity out there?
A couple things. One, I think that in the past it's been almost a myopathy problem. In other words, I didn't consider product requirements. And so by that, I mean secrets management, API security, those kinds of things. So things that were super, super important in the business. And that comes from business mapping and understand that. So not taking enough time to understand the enterprise and making sure they had a kind of a complete understanding, or at least close there too, before doing that. And products usually that, because there's just too big a chasm today between products and security. The other thing I would tell you is the integration things that I talked about. We make assumptions. Oh, surely this will do that, or that system will work with what I'm doing, and whether it's legacy applications that Chris brought up or something else, the integration was probably too many assumptions there that it would work with something, our plan, our design, or those kinds of things. And then the last thing I think that we didn't always consider, and I'm hyper focused on it these days, is the identity experience. Notice I didn't say user experience. The user experience is super important, right? I mean, if the thing that you're doing, right, and again, assuming that there's a team of people that are working on this, right, and you got the team that's delivering the service, team that is using the service, you have a team that's integrating that service into your product, and then you get this other team that just happens to be responsible for making sure that service doesn't get broken or is used effectively to protect the organization. If you don't understand what that experience is, that's pretty tough. I can remember at one organization that I was at where when Okta was just, they were on their hockey stick kind of growth cycle. I mean, they were just calling people left and right, and our folks were leaving in droves. So when you think about even the experience of those that are responsible for it, it's super difficult, right? And so recruiting and training, it all kind of comes together. Some of these things aren't unique to identity, but if we believe what we're saying as it being a core center of gravity to so much of what we do, they just are amplified and with the identity difficulties.
Yeah, if we think about identity being that core or that center of what we're doing, how do we evangelize that to our users, right? To help them understand why we're building this thing and how we want to make it easier for them to do their job, to make sure they understand that we're just doing this to reduce risk and enable the business.
Yeah, your chief evangelists and all this stuff is your security leaders and those kinds of things. I held a job as a kind of that evangelist outside of the security organization, and that can be hard, right? And because a lot of those business units are the proverbial widget makers, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They're like, hey, I'm making widgets that pay our paychecks and make our business grow. So evangelism is more outside an organization than it is outside an organization. It's not a telling function, but it's also a listening function. People also sometimes lose sight of that, right? So if you're the cheerleader that just goes in and says, cyber's really bad, everybody's trying to hurt us all the time, as opposed to going in and saying, I'd love to understand what you do as a business or as a teammate, so that I can make sure that I plan and execute accordingly so we're all successful.
That's a great point.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. We could go on and talk about identity for hours, days, months, but unfortunately, our time here has really come to the tail end of the discussion here. But I want to ask a question, a code blue question. So this isn't necessarily tied to identity or anything that we've talked about today. But my final question for and we'll start with Paul and Chris, and then end with Dave. But in your opinion, what's the biggest misconception that non-technical business leaders have about cybersecurity, and how do we bridge the gap? I know we're short on time, so let's just go with some short answers here. But Paul, over to you first.
Sure. I think often it's the same one that a lot of IT and security administrators have, that we think a tool is going to fix something, and that we're going to get solve this problem in silos without talking to each other and really aligning with the business. So I think that is often a problem in cybersecurity and IT in general.
A huge misconception in my mind is that non-technical leaders see security as a cost center, right? And we're not producing the widgets, to your point earlier, but we are reducing risk, so to make sure that things are secure down the road. So we've got to get better about telling the story of how we're reducing risk and enabling business. That's our plight to the people above us, to help them understand that we're not here just sucking out their budget.
The biggest perception that I see is that security professionals do not have the business acumen that they need to really understand and manage risk appropriately. And that perception comes from reality. That's just a fact in our community, gang. And we need to be on a journey to improve and develop our own business acumen so that we can sit and have relevant conversations with our business partners to overcome all the challenges that we've talked about today. Because, you know, my glass is always half full. I'll take on a challenge any day. But these are not insurmountable things. But, you know, business about relationships. And when Chad and I were commanders, we used to say that, right? It's not a commander that accomplishes the mission. It's the relationship between commanders that does that. So we need to up our game a little bit. That's our baggage. That's not their baggage. So if you're just talking geeks and squeaks to other business leaders or non-technical people, then that's your fault.
Yeah, and Dave, I got to say, you know, to the points raised here, I'm seeing more and more articles that discuss, right. The CISO started out as that technical person, but really now what it's growing into and what organizations are really looking for now is that CISO that, yes, has a technical understanding, but maybe even more important and critically is the business acumen that was discussed. So really appreciate the discussion here today, gentlemen. Paul and Chris, I work with you guys every day. Always a pleasure to spend time with you and to talk with you. And Dave, 30 years of friendship. Really, really grateful. Really appreciate you coming on as our first guest on Code Blue to talk identity. So thank you very much for your time and thank you for being a part of this webinar. So till next time, have a great day and we'll see you on the backside.
Take care, everyone. Be well.